On to our next panel, and just before we do move on there, I wanted just to share that Daniel Knapp, our Cheif Economist, who will be moderating this panel, a couple of weeks ago released a paper which actually looked at the socio-economic value of targeted advertising. So I'm just going to put a link to the paper in the chat box so that people can access that. Brilliant. Okay, so as we move forward, let's just check and see where all of our panelists, here we are. Hi, Danny. Hi, Daniel. Hello. Just wait for everyone, just give it a second for everyone to connect. So we move on to our supply chain transparency panel. So this panel, as mentioned, is going to be moderated by Daniel Knapp. And Daniel, I will let you introduce your panel.
Thank you very much, Helen. Supply chain, a fairly obscure topic happening behind the scenes, but if we just survey what's happening around the world across industries, we can see how crucial a functioning supply chain is for all industries. If we look at the UK, fuel shortages, lack of lorry drivers, a lot of downstream effects on consumers. If we look at the global supply chains, we can see that shipping times take longer, costs are exploding. In July 2020, it cost $2,000 to ship a container from Asia to Europe. Now it costs $14,000. Not just in advertising, but everywhere, supply chains are crucial. But in advertising, where we often have an intangible asset and things are happening behind the scenes algorithmically, we can't really see what's going on, it's even more important. And in particular, the topic about how transparent is our supply chain, not just how effective is it, but how transparent is it? How many actors are being declared? What information can we glean about the functioning of our ads and so forth? A topic that all of the panelists that are with me on here today have talked about at length in other panels, in op-eds, in their companies, because it's a huge topic for the industry. I'm very pleased to welcome Kalyuzhny from PubMatic, Francis Hudson from Sourcepoint, Daniel Clayman from Xandr, and Fabien Couasnon from Taboola. Welcome, everybody. And Fabien, I'm going to start right with you. You heard my little global contextualization. Why is the transparency of the supply chain so important in digital advertising?
Hi, everyone. Sorry in advance. I don't understand why my video is not working, so sorry for that. So yeah, let me answer your question. So basically, the programmatic ecosystem is a very complex one where we find different companies providing different products and where they are all connected to each other. So basically, this leads to a complex architecture that helps in a way advertisers to get access to multiple tools or features and software. But in another way, it also leads to a lack of transparency due to this complexity. And also, I want to add a second point, like our industry has been shocked by several scandals, like Facebook, for instance. So most of ad tech companies want to improve the transparency to first maintain trust, obviously, from our clients, and to find new ways to constantly improve the efficiency on ad dollar invested.
Fabien, thanks for that context. I think transparency sounds like a noble cause, but it's also a term that many people regard in different ways. In particular, when we look at advertising transparency, what are we talking about? Are we talking about fee transparency? Are we talking about declaring all the actors in the programmatic value chain? Does it link to disinformation, i.e. where do ads run, that we had in a panel previously, or something else? So what really is transparency? And then we first need to define that before we can actually talk about making our supply chain transparent and thereby turning it from a supply to a value chain. Francis, I know you have some strong views on that.
Yeah, so I think transparency can mean different things to different partners in the supply chain. Obviously, the brands are looking to understand where their media is going. I think publishers are trying to understand where the money is going. And then I think there's also the consumer angle, which is obviously becoming increasingly important as privacy regulations change and consumers being more aware of actually what advertising is happening and actually what data is being captured on them. And I think the supply chain in general, you can't talk about it, the programmatic supply chain, you can't talk about it in isolation from the data that is being transmitted. And I think that therefore that's a sort of important concept of it. So yeah, I think that it can mean different things to different people.
And Lisa, you work with many publishers, with many people on the buy side. Based on your interactions, how do you define supply chain transparency and what's really the core aspect of it?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think that oftentimes we get asked if we're fully transparent, and I always ask the buyer back, what does transparency mean to you? And I think that it really goes back to trust, and it's trust in programmatic, it's trust in the vendors, trust in the emerging channels, and overall that trust in the industry. And the only way that you're going to get trust is from education, because you don't know what you don't know. So if you don't know it and it's murky, and as our the previous panel talked about all of the technicalities of our industry, it can get really convoluted. So it goes back to making sure that you as a vendor can educate the buy side, educate the publishers to fully understand the ecosystem, because then that will stick out from a trust and transparency perspective. And I know that the IAB has spent a lot of time doing 101 education videos. So it's a great source to take the time to understand what's within the supply chain.
I think that's an interesting point. You also brought in this other key term, trust. Just a quick follow-up for you. Do you see that transparency creates trust, or that trust changes the criteria or the demands for transparency?
I definitely think that that trust is part of the transparency ecosystem, and that once you have that trust, and then that kind of the transparency module is more open. But then again, once you break that trust, I think it's like any relationship. You enter in a relationship, whether it's a personal one or a business one, that you trust your partners. And then when, and the education piece has to go alongside it. And once you have that education and once you have that trust, then you don't even need to question the transparency. And once it's broken, it then, as the ISBA study confirmed, and why we have all these panels based on that, is because something broke within that ecosystem. And now it's going back to the vendors rebuilding that trust.
I think you mentioned a crucial point. Something broke along the way. And you mentioned the ISBA study, which, for instance, found a 15% delta, unmatched data buy and sell side. But it also, I think, illustrated how technically challenging it was to match and analyze the data to really actually come to transparency, because siloed data, different definitions and so forth, made it really hard to just get to that point. And now we see the ANA in the US launching a similar study. And we've had, as you said, transparency supply chain panels for the last 2 years. To all of you, maybe Dan, I'm going to start with you. What has really changed since that ISBA study? What transparency options are now available for buyers, for instance, that weren't available before the study was being pushed? Or is there no relationship at all between what's currently on offer and how the industry has evolved and the picture that the study has painted?
Yeah, I think there was a lot happening before the ISBA study emerged. And frankly, I wouldn't use the ISBA study as the benchmark for how that should be done going forward. The methodology.
Can you elaborate on that?
I think it was the methodologies used I didn't agree with, and there were timelines put in place that rushed it through without thinking about any of the contractual limitations of our industry and the frankly complexity that exists in our industry. There's been a lot that's been done predating the ISBA study from various companies in the space. Others have shied away from it. 2 or 3 years ago, if you wanted to get full access to your media costs across the supply chain, you could do that, and you can do it today. If you want to see those fees, if it's a fee conversation that you're interested in as a brand, then you can do it. Many of our RFPs that we see today come from brands for the sell side. Go back 5 years, that was never a thing. You would get a DSP pitch. A lot of brands are taking more control at this point, and they're leaning into the conversation as opposed to it being one that they would necessarily just rely on their partners for. So I think marketers have certainly, one of the benefits of the ISBA studies is education. That was the main output for me that had an impact. And you've seen various studies in the US that have taken elements of what ISBA were trying to achieve along the way. And frankly, the most important piece of it was collaboration that's come off the back of it. There's a lot of companies in the space that technically compete with each other that have been able to have sensible conversations about what the industry should look like going forward, and to the benefit of brands and publishers and consumers ultimately.
And coming back to you, Lisa, in particular, looking at that acronym SPO, which of course also means that there is, well, a new business model or a new way of optimizing to make the supply chain more transparent. Would you predate that to the ISPA study, and kind of what is SPO and what's the state of it today in the context of this debate?
Yeah, and I think I will answer that question, but one thing to add, Daniel, when you said that something is broken, I wouldn't necessarily say that the studies highlighted that something was broken. I think it highlighted that questions weren't asked. And it goes back to that education piece. And looking at things like SPO, our industry loves acronyms, and how we look at things in consolidation. SPO is just an acronym that pushed, as Danny just said, they're getting RFIs from brands. And it's not just a conversation with the DSP, it's the conversation from the entire buy side. So people are trying to educate themselves, trying to understand things better. And so it goes to consolidation in SPO has been happening for quite some time. I think prior to the ISBA study, I think the ISBA study just pushed the door further open. And we've seen these conversations happening, I think, for the past maybe 4, even 5 years. And it's just more that the buy side is leaning in and working with their SSP partners to say, you know what, this is the tech we need. This is how we're defining transparency. This is what's important to us. We don't just want the connection to this DSP. We want to understand the whole ecosystem. And therefore, there's just partnership and working together and allowing your vendors to innovate for you.
I think you both, Lisa and Danny, made some very important points. First, let's dispel that myth that a single study was causally responsible for changing how an industry operates. Maybe call out some things, but the industry was already moving to making the supply chain more transparent and more accessible. And we often talk about standards and certifications in this industry, but I think both of you mentioned how education is important and how individual buyer requirements are crucial. So to the entire panel, when you look at your customers and conversations around supply chain transparency, are there common patterns of what people ask for? And do we need standards for that? Or is it highly subjective? And does every company have their own KPIs attached to the notion of transparency?
If I can answer on this one, obviously we need more standardization. This is key for all the supply chain and for buyers, obviously. But I want to emphasize again that educate buyers is very important. Why? Because basically IAB is providing initiative, and I do think that most of well-known ad tech companies are compliant with all those initiatives, such as at CXT, seller.json, or supply chain object. But then we don't have a lot of discussion, I would say, on the buy side on do you check and do you look at deeply on your reports to make the best choice, actually. So it's good to talk about SPO, it's good to talk about transparency and all initiative, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that all actors in our industry will act as it is.
Let's stay a little bit on the topic of education. Fabien, you said people need to start looking at the data that is available to them. And Lisa, you also stressed the notion of education. Who should educate, and what skills should really be educated? Is it how to use a tool? Is it what questions do you ask? Is it really a question of technology, or is it one about process? Let's bring a little bit of color to this term education. Who wants to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the IAB has done a great job doing that education. And obviously, they're an independent source. So as buyers or publishers ask, their vendors to do the education, the vendor is obviously going to have a bias. But I definitely would say starting with the IAB, because there's a ton of education videos, and you guys do host things like events like this. So I think that helps get the brain flowing and the questions done. And I know that IAB Europe put out the what was it, the supply chain transparency question? I don't remember, Daniel, but it was last year.
Transparency guide, yes.
Guide, yes, thank you. And it really helped, I think, navigate the ecosystem for every single part of that ecosystem, because you can enter that guide and say, okay, I'm a publisher, and as a publisher, these are the questions I should ask. And then as a buyer, these are the questions I should ask. And as a SSP, these are the questions I should ask. And that helps drive the conversation. So then you can have the conversation with the DSP and the SSP and the DMP and whoever else, and gain your knowledge that way.
I'd love to come back to you, Danny, based on what this Lisa said, to get a feeling of how you encounter this buyer education in particular in the day-to-day. How are you today communicating with your partners versus a couple of years ago? Are they asking you the right question, or are you still telling them what they should be asking for?
I think it stems from the primary goals of the end marketing director or CM. We should keep in mind that the conversation that they will be having with their CFO at the end of the year probably isn't going to be about transparency. It's going to be about business results and profitability and sales and whatever else. So transparency needs to be at the heart of either the brand or the brand ethics, if you like, or those of the person that's making the budget decisions. And it's not always top. Now, that's not to say that it should be, because there's plenty of good business models out there that we see that drive results for clients that aren't transparent. And more often than not in the pandemic, there was more budget going to them than other places. At the same time, most large brands and holding companies are leaning into a conversation that starts with the supply chain, knowing that the DSP just isn't enough at this stage. They need to be able to control more of where their spend goes. They want to understand how they can do that with fewer partners than more. And I think there's just in what I mentioned earlier around the number of RFIs and different things coming around from buyers around the globe, asking the question would suggest that the education is happening. Where they're getting it from, I'm not entirely sure. I think actually the vendors in the space do a really good job of saying and the more that we can get this education centralized, to Lisa's point, to independent parties, so that we can increase the knowledge holistically, we'll be in a really good place.
I think that's a really interesting observation. You said, that transparency in programmatic, it's a technical thing. It started as an operational discussion, but the CMO doesn't really look day-to-day at transparency. But if this conversation can be elevated to a strategic level, to an ethical brand reputation level, it's an entirely different thing. And here, Francis, I'd love to come back to you as you look at this primarily from a consumer lens. Are you seeing kind of the ethical considerations around supply chain transparency? Are you seeing that changing? Are you seeing different types of people asking for insights on this?
Yeah, so I suppose I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle to the rest of the panelists. I think that the supply chain is driven by incentive. The KPIs that the brands are looking at, those are central to where the money goes. And the programmatic supply chain originally was not built for transparency and has evolved as the technologies have disrupted in the space. And now we have very complex and growing complexity in algorithms that are driving where media goes. And I think that has then had a knock-on effect on the lack of trust, which then has pushed forward the agenda of the transparency conversation. And I think right now we're going through a massive shift, because the underlying measurement of the ecosystem is changing and adapting. And you can see that already with Apple environments, and how a lot of the attribution measurement for Safari or apps is based on probabilistic methods. So we see Google made an announcement earlier this week that they're going to be shifting their kind of measurement framework from a last click to something which is a lot more probabilistic. And I think from my perspective, I'm looking at those measurement frameworks and the complexity of those algorithms, and the fact that those systems and machines don't necessarily have a sense of morality. I think that's the lens that I'm looking at it through. So all of the companies in the supply chain are constantly having to adapt and hack their way around the new rules that come in for the system. And that has then a knock-on effect on consumers and the data that's being shared. That's how I'm looking at things.
And in the industry itself, we've developed many standards or toolkits. We think of ads, text, sellers, JSON, and so forth. There's an array of files out there that can potentially aid transparency. But is education plus these standards enough, or does need something more to be built on these standards like ads text. What do you think, Lisa? What really provides this transparency? The standards alone or something?
I definitely think we're getting there. And I would say that the standards ads.txt, when it first started, was a huge movement in the right direction, and adding in something like sellers.json and then adding in education, we're miles ahead of where we were 2 or 3 years ago. But I think that there's that blue ocean where, as an industry, it's going to be ever evolving. So I don't think we can ever sit back and say, oh, we're done, we don't need to do anything else, we've educated enough, because our industry evolves so quickly, new formats come out so quickly, and we have to continue to stay on top of making sure that people understand what the formats are, how to measure them, what is viewability like, all of those things. So I don't think we'll ever be able to say, okay, we've done enough, we can put our feet up. But I think we're really, as an industry, we've come very far.
So you are seeing transparency as an ongoing effort that necessarily needs to accompany the evolution of the industry as new formats come in, as they mature, if with different devices, supply chains, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yep, 100%. Because it's even looking at something like mobile, where it's been the year of mobile for the past, I don't know, decade plus, the measurement for mobile is so different for in-app than it is for display. And then now looking at CTV and the challenges you have there from a measurement perspective and from a device ID perspective, you have to continuously evolve with that and be able to educate everyone and support it.
I think we can easily come to this paradox from a media buying perspective now, excluding the consumer now, where everyone realizes, well, transparency is important. It's important in this industry. It's maybe important for fees, etc. But at the same time, it's so complex. I need to be re-educated. New formats are changing. So transparency becomes an opportunity and a liability at the same time. So I think we can only really fix that if we really ask, is transparency really an end in itself, or how does transparency of the supply chain create real value, real business value? And Danny alluded to that already when he brought in the perspective of the CMO. Fabien, also know that you have some strong views about this. What value can be created through transparency to ensure that everybody really wants to continue this, lifelong education that Lisa is alluding to?
Yeah, as we talked before, I do think that the word transparency has different meanings. So do we talk here about margin, tracking, or product efficiency? So if our main goal is to maintain the open web as it is, or even improve it, I think then, yes, transparency is part of the key initiative. But in terms of value, I do think that the value resides in a multiple of metrics, which each bring a certain value. So it does not have one value, but several values. There is where I think each client must understand what they are buying and what values are important to them. So they won't ask for, so let's be concrete. So when you buy vegetables, you don't ask what the producer margin is, but you want to know where they come from and how they were produced. So for me, transparency is key and provides value, but we all need to understand what we really want, and for how much. And I think this is one of the key questions to me.
So I think we've seen in this panel that transparency of the programmatic supply chain is not a new topic. We have all spoken about this in several panels. There has been some major evolution in the industry, fueled also by some external commentary, but it's remaining complex. And we might never fully get there, as it's a lifelong education. But I would like from each of you in the last remaining 2 minutes, just get your prediction. Where we will be in this debate in the next 12 months? Are there some milestones we've hit, some problems we've solved? What's your point of view? Francis, I'm going to start with you.
I think that some of the sort of macro trends that are happening in terms of the changes to browsers and the effects that they're having will shift the conversation somewhat to understanding some of the measurement frameworks that are going to be used for the future. At the moment, in different environments, there's completely different frameworks for measuring things. And I think that we're going to need to shine a light on something that is a common methodology across those environments.
Danny, what's your view?
Yeah, I think as it relates to fee transparency, if I was to take that aspect of the transparency discussion, I think, as I said earlier, there's a lot of momentum in this conversation with the industry. And I think it's come to a point where Most large brands and agencies have decided at this stage whether or not transparency is table stakes. And if it's not, then, there's plenty of ways that you can do business in this ecosystem without it. Where I think we're heading to is an environment where advertisers continue to take more control. I think they have good ideas of who they can partner with. There's a handful of companies out there in the programmatic, DSP and SSP world that can do this well. I think there's probably a sort of conversation that happens following that is either around trust or cost and what is acceptable from a cost point of view. And that's completely up to each and every brand owner or CMO, marketing director that you speak to, how they deem value. But that's the logical step from a fee transparency conversation, is what is sensible in the industry from a cost point of view.
And Lisa?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's about collaboration. And with collaboration, you'll get education and partnerships. So everyone in that ecosystem working closer together to help push for that ongoing transparency and ongoing trust. But then looking at the open internet. So identity is a huge topic and something that I know we're having a lot of conversations about, but really making sure that we're fueling that open internet instead of those walled gardens.
Wonderful. Lastly, Fabien, your 20-second view on the future?
It's hard to talk after Lisa, and then better collaboration obviously will help the industry. I think at the end of the day, all ad tech companies need to provide more maybe exclusive products or exclusive inventory, or to help buyers to navigate into our complex.
Thank you so much for summarizing this view of the future. I think we've seen supply chain transparency is an ongoing topic that is increasing with complexity of devices, new channels, formats, which is further spurred by, well, changes in how digital advertising works in terms of moving from an open market to maybe walled or hedged gardens. Lots of things are changing, but with every decision on how advertising operates, is transacted, there are new challenges about transparency and also what value is being created through this transparency, i.e. how a supply chain through transparency can be transformed into a value chain that is value generating for every participant involved, buyers, sellers, and of course, last but not least, the consumer. At IAB Europe, we are going to continue to monitor these developments, launch new presentations on latest trends in this area, how it intersects with cookies, with walled gardens, with hedged gardens, and so forth. Plenty to talk about in the next couple of months. And thank you very much. And I'm going to be passing back to our host.